Hello, my name is Luke Colosi, and I am a post-baccalaureate researcher at the Scripps Institute of Oceanography. I work with Professor Sarah T. Gilly and Dr. Bia Villas-Boas. To begin, I'd like to acknowledge NASA and the Heisting Scholarship Program for helping fund this project, and Remote Sensing Systems and Ephemer for providing data. Today, I will be talking about the seasonal cycle of significant wave height in the ocean, local versus remote forcing. To motivate this talk, the background of this presentation slide shows ocean vector winds off the coast of South Africa. This illustrates a local wind event, and we will be discussing how local wind events influence the wave climate. This presentation is connected to a paper recently submitted to the Journal of Geophysical Research, Oceans. More details will be given at the end of this presentation. To begin, we want to understand some fundamental characteristics of wind and wave climates across the ocean. It is known that surface gravity waves are the result of both local forcing and remote forcing. Locally forced waves are known as wind seas, whereas remotely forced waves are known as swell. High latitude storms generate swell that propagates towards the equator. Due to the seasonal pattern of storm systems, the wave height of swell undergoes a seasonal cycle, which is illustrated here in these monthly climatologies. These monthly climatologies are computed across the North Pacific in the top panel and the South Pacific in the bottom panel. This illustrates that the main variability seen in the wave field and wind fields on hemispheric scales is a seasonal cycle where you have high winds and waves in the winter time and low wind and waves in the summertime. In most world oceans, remotely forced surface waves dominate the wave field, which is again illustrated in these panels to the left. However, deviations from the hemispheric scale seasonal pattern in significant wave height are sometimes present. For example, off the coast of California, if we look at the monthly climatology in significant wave height within this box illustrated in the panel to the left, we see that there's a bump in significant wave height during the spring and summer months. If we look at the local winds during this time, we see that there's a peak or a maximum in wind speed during the same period of time. This peak in wind speed is known as a local wind phenomenon known as expansion fan winds. Note that the annual cycle of wind speed is 6 months off the hemispheric or out of phase with the hemispheric scale winds. And so what was discovered by Villas-Boas 2017 was that the local wind event was generating locally forced waves that dominated the wave field over the remotely forced waves propagating from the southern hemisphere during the summertime. And so they dominated the waves up to 50% of the time, causing there to be an increase in significant wave height and a deviation from the seasonal cycle. Therefore, based on the observations made off the coast of California, we want to ask the following questions. Where in the world oceans are local winds out of phase with hemispheric scale winds? Is the seasonality in the California coast region seen in these other wind regions, atypical wind regions? And what factors determine whether a seasonal augmentation, that bump in significant wave height, is present in these other regions? And can locally generated waves be responsible for this augmentation? In order to answer these questions, we use global satellite-derived significant wave height and wind speed observations over the time period from 1993 to 2015. For significant wave height, we use a satellite altimetry product produced by the French Research Institute for Exploration of the Seas, Ephemer. And for wind speed, we use a wind vector analysis product from Remote Sensing Systems. To complement our analysis, we use a WaveWatch 3 hidecast produced by Ephemer. To analyze this data, we use two methods. First, we fit an annual and semi-annual cycle model to significant wave height and wind speed data to look at the seasonality. And then we use monthly climatologies in order to analyze the mean states of the wind and wave fields and investigate interannual variability. Let's begin by looking at the timing and magnitude of the annual cycle for significant wave height and wind speed across the world oceans. What we see in significant wave height and wind speed is that the northern hemisphere, generally, the northern hemisphere is 6 months out of phase with the southern hemisphere, as we see a generally blue northern hemisphere and orange red southern hemisphere. And then comparing the two figures side by side, generally significant wave height and wind speed are in phase with each other. And now looking at the amplitude, we can see for both significant wave height and wind speed that wind and waves in high latitudes of the northern hemisphere experience more seasonality than in the southern hemisphere. So using the annual cycle phase for wind speed, we are able to identify regions where local winds are out of phase with hemispheric scale winds. We label these atypical regions as summer wind anomaly regions, or SWARs. The criterion for SWARs is that the wind speed maximum must occur during the spring, summer, or fall months of the northern and southern hemisphere. In the panel at the top, we highlight all these regions in the northern and southern hemisphere, and they are located in eastern boundary current regions, monsoon regions, and regions significantly sheltered from remotely forced waves. Also, there are a few open ocean regions. Here we will focus on only a few regions to simplify our analysis, and these include the South African western coast, this southern Caribbean Sea, and the coast off of Morocco. Now we take a closer look at these SWARs by looking at their regional climatologies. In the northern hemisphere, off the coast of Africa, northwest African coast, we see that there is a seasonal augmentation in significant wave height present during the summer months, and it coincides with a wind speed maximum. But in the southern hemisphere, we see that there's no seasonal augmentation present, and there is a broad increase in wind speed throughout the spring, summer, and fall months. Therefore, we conclude that there are other factors than wind speeds that determine whether a seasonal augmentation will be present in significant wave heights climate. Factors include exposure to swell generated from high latitudes, swell's annual cycle amplitude, and the strength of the local winds. For the Namibian coast, it has exposure to swell generated from the Southern Ocean, and this swell has a low amplitude annual cycle, which means that there's going to be persistent swell propagating up into that wave field. Now we take a closer look at the Southern Caribbean Sea, and we see that wind and wave climates here are distinctly different than eastern boundary current regions we just discussed. For example, wind and waves both have strong semi-annual cycles. Waves almost have no annual cycle, and wind and waves are in phase. A lack of an annual cycle for waves suggests that the wave field is forced entirely by local winds. And this makes sense because waves in this region are sheltered by the islands or the archipelago islands, and they shelter waves propagating from the North Pacific. Therefore, you have no remotely forced waves entering this wave field, and therefore local winds must generate all the wave activity in this region. Now, we hypothesize that significant wave height seasonal augmentations are caused by local wind events. This is true if locally forced waves in SWARs dominate the wave field during the time period of when these seasonal augmentations are present. In order to test this hypothesis, we will use wave age to separate growing seas from fully developed seas. The wave age criterion is defined as the peak phase speed divided by the wind speed 10 meters above the ocean. If wave age is greater than 1.2, the waves are outrunning the local winds such that the winds are no longer imparting momentum or energy into the wave field, and they are now categorized as fully developed, remotely forced waves. If the ratio is less than or equal to 1.2, the atmosphere is still actively imparting energy and momentum, and therefore they are growing seas and locally forced waves. Using wave age, we can compute a probability of swell, which quantifies the number of swell events relative to the total number of wave events over a given time period. So n swell represents all the points in time, periods of time where wave age is greater than 1.2. So probability of swell will provide the fraction of time that the wave field is swell dominated. We calculate probability of swell using WaveWatch 3 peak frequency and the wind forcing for this HIDECast, Climate Forecast System Real Analysis winds. And we compute probability swell over the 3-month periods of December, January, February, and June, July, August. Now, looking at the SWAR regions of focus, for the Northern Hemisphere, we see that the wave field is dominated by wind seas a higher percentage of the time than in its surrounding regions. And we see that by this deep low in probability of swell in all 3 regions. Now, looking at the Southern Hemisphere, the probability of swell is not as low as the Northern Hemisphere. These results suggest that the seasonal augmentation in significant wave height results from locally forced waves. Furthermore, Southern Hemisphere swars are less likely to be dominated by locally forced waves, and therefore less likely for a seasonal augmentation in significant wave height to be present. To conclude, we have identified geographically where local winds are out of phase with hemispheric scale winds, and we have labeled these as summer wind anomaly regions. We have shown in our regional climatologies that anomalous patterns of wave variability do not necessarily drive anomalous patterns in the wave climate. Therefore, the seasonality present in the California coastal swar are not universal for all swars because the fraction of wave variability attributed to local wind events varies depending on regional and wave field characteristics such as exposure to swell, swell's annual cycle amplitude, and local wind strength. In this study, we have presented a method to evaluate the relative importance of wind seas and swell from mean behavior of the wave field without the need for directional wave spectra. For future studies, global observations of directional wave spectra from remote sensing platforms such as Chinese, French oceanographic satellite CFOStat or other proposed Doppler oceanography missions have the potential to further our understanding of the effects of local winds on the wave climate by providing concurrent observations of wind and waves and being able to distinguish the roles of swell, wind seas, and mixed seas in determining wave climates. Here you may find links to the preprint of our paper submitted to JGR, along with source code that will reproduce all figures shown in this presentation and in our paper, a preliminary data repository, and a GitHub repository. Also see my contact information at the bottom. Thank you for your time.